Thank you, Manuel. Greetings from the East Coast, from Harlem, New York, where I'm coming to join you. My job, as I understand it, and I see a lot of you, wearing your USC gear, and so a lot of you are students. And my understanding is my job is to get you excited about statistics. And your professors weren't able to do it. They certainly weren't able to do it in my case. But hopefully, if we're not excited about the statistics, we'll at least be interested in the stories that they tell about our communities. So I'm just going to paint a brief picture of both about African migration over the last 40 years or so to the United States. So just some key facts, a couple of key facts about California, and then some issues to think about specific to the new wave of African immigration. To start off framing, we have to, of course, say there have always been, before there was an America, there were Africans in America. There's been migration from the African continent to America for centuries. But we also know that after the end of the transatlantic slave trade, the doors between the U.S. and Africa largely closed. And it really wasn't until the 1970s, with changes in U.S. immigration policy and also changes on the continent, the end of colonialism and so forth, that we started to see a new wave of immigration from the African continent to the U.S. And many of you, either you or your parents or your neighbors were part of those waves. And the wave may have started small, but it grew very quickly. In 1980, there were only 130,000 people born in Africa living in all of the United States. Just to put that in perspective, there's more than that living in New York City right now. And in every decade since then, that number has more than doubled. So today, there are over 1.8 million people living in the United States who were born on the African continent, including 1.5 million born in sub-Saharan Africa, in the countries south of the Sahara. And to put that in perspective, that is as large a migration as originally came to the U.S. Were abducted to the U.S. through the transatlantic slave trade. So it's an enormous migration. 20% of the growth in African America over the last decades has actually come from immigration. So immigrants from Africa, from the Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos, are a significant and growing part of the Black diaspora in the United States and of the immigrant community, even if we're not always a visible part of that diaspora. So who are these 1.5 million immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa? So some of the countries' names will be familiar to you: Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Somalia, Liberia, Sudan, Sierra Leone. 70% of immigrants from Africa come from those top 10 countries. And they live largely in cities like Los Angeles, in large metro areas, in New York, in DC, in Atlanta, in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And the communities that African immigrants have made look very different from city to city. So I'll give you an example. My office is in the Bronx, New York, and our African immigrant community in New York is heavily West African. Lots of folks from Ghana, lots of folks from French-speaking West Africa, the whole sort of range of French-speaking West African countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone. But you go 4 hours on a train down to Washington, D.C., where we're actually in the process of building our second chapter, and it's predominantly folks from Ethiopia, Eritrea, many Somalis, and so with each of the cities where African immigrants have settled. And our different communities take different paths, different trajectories to get to the United States. So I think a common misconception is that most people who are here are refugees, like they came from refugee camps, they were resettled. That is a part of who comes to the United States, and some communities like Somalians, Liberians, a lot of folks, that is how people entered. But most people come through other programs. Has anyone here heard of a program called the Diversity Visa or the Green Card Lottery? Yeah, okay, most people. So people know that this is a way that people from countries that don't have a lot of representation here, that don't have large communities here, can actually apply to get a green card, to get permanent residency here in the US. And Africans are a major beneficiary of that program. Something like 40% of the Green Card Lottery recipients were from sub-Saharan Africa, or from Africa rather. Africans come through student visas, they come through family reunification, they come through work visas, and though it's not always visible within African immigrant communities, many African immigrants are undocumented. We have a lot of discussions within our community about how we're not as out and proud and loud about being undocumented. There's a lot of shame, there's a lot of secrecy. But when you talk to people, everybody has an uncle, an auntie, a cousin who is in that situation. So we're not different from other immigrant communities in those ways. Just to make to inject a quick point about California in specific, the black immigration in California is divided almost equally between immigrants from Africa and immigrants from 3 countries, Jamaica, Belize, and this might come as a surprise to some folks and not to others, Mexico. So there's, when we say African, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latino, there is a black diaspora from each of those countries that is arriving. We're focusing our comments mostly on the African immigrant community, but each of those communities deserves a really deep dive and some real examination. I want to just make one point to conclude, there's been a lot of press and interest in the question of African immigrant educational attainment, and the fact that actually African immigrants are among the highest achieving academically groups in the U.S., neck and neck with Asian Americans. And a lot of questions. What is it? Is it something in the water? Is it something in the fufu or the injera that we really what it seems like it's mostly about is who gets to come to America from Africa. There are huge barriers to get, there's an ocean to start with, but also huge administrative and financial barriers. So the folks who end up coming from the African continent, many are people who are invested in by their families and by their communities to come to the US, to earn funds, to send home, to be an anchor in this country for other people. That's, it varies by community, but that's a very common story. And a lot of people come here, they earn money, they send a lot of it home, and so people come with high expectations. But the reality is that we often fall off a very large cliff when we come to America. One of the stereotypes that has a lot of truth in it is the African cab driver with a master's degree, or who's a pharmacist, or who's an accountant in their home country, but isn't able to use their education to advance. And one of the most telling statistics about that is that Africans get one of the worst returns economically on education of any group. If you are, I think there are ways that African immigrants outpace native-born African Americans. Our employment rates tend to be higher, for example, but the return we get from education is worse than not only native-born African Americans, but even from Afro-Caribbean immigrants. We get half as much benefit from having a college degree. So myself, as an organizer, I think that a lot of that is about organizing. The way that you get a job is through a network. You get a job through people organizing and helping each other. And so I think that just poses to us a challenge. We're all working, a lot of Africans were working hard, trying to advance, trying to get that degree, trying to get that good job, and we're working on our own. But I think part of the story of immigration in America, and not just immigration, but of the African American community in America, is that people have advanced by working together. So I think that's the challenge for all our communities.
Great. Let's give them a big round of applause.